last learning outcome will focus on how do we do effective review of human resources, or people who are involved in staff, people, employees who are involved in managing and supervising, and also, looking at the say the output, basically producing the output of the organization in terms of productivity, efficiency, targets, goals, objectives. Those will need to be looking at how do we look at measurements at the end of it, and that's the last learning outcome. So the measurements will involve, theoretical frameworks like balanced scorecard. We look at management by objectives. We look at annual appraisals, 360-degree feedback, and how in general, organizations look at improving the output and performance of employees when they are working within the organization. So the learning outcome 3, we are going to be looking at, going through, a presentation. And in this, we will be covering understanding of how do we use human resources effectively? How do we look at maximizing, the use of human resources? So there's a fair bit of content, 4 assessment criteria that we're looking at in this particular learning outcome. And this includes, understanding what is human resource planning as a process, because within any organization, when we look at hiring people, training them, look at putting them into training and development, and giving them roles and responsibilities to perform, we need to look at also the process of how this whole let's put it this way, how this whole process comes into being. And that process is called the HRP, Human Resources Planning. And that is where it starts with recruitment and selection. It looks at appraisals, reviews, grievances, rewards and incentives. And we'll discuss a bit of that, going into the overall process. Then we also look at, motivational theories. Motivational theories are important. There are, 17 or 18 different motivational theories, but we are going to be focused on understanding the major ones like Maslow's theory of hierarchy, theory X and Y, Herzberg's 2-factor theory, Bloom's theory. And here the idea would be to try and relate, apart from understanding the theoretical aspects of it, that how it came about, what are these theories, what they propagate and what they propose. We are going to be looking at how we apply these theories to, human resources. That means how do you apply this to a workforce within an organization? And the idea of using these theories is to basically keep the workforce motivated. And motivation of workforce can be done through various different ways, and we'll discuss that in the assessment criteria. Looking at a bit of specific methods which are used to measure employee performance. Those are bits that we'll cover here, and what are the various reward systems that we look at in different organizations and in what context they are put forward is also something that we will go into. Now, in order to read this and get into detailing, what we are looking at is essentially going through some parts of, this framework, which is given in terms of indicative content, and we'll cover that during the course of our discussion, specifically when we look at going into the learning outcome 3 as assessment criteria. So let me switch you over to, the presentation that we'll be looking at today to discuss this learning outcome. So here is where we are looking at a couple of things with regards to, the indicative content that we have to look at covering. And what we also want to be able to do is primarily focus on these broad aspects. One is human resource planning, looking at monitoring and performance, looking at reward systems, and a bit of employee engagement. Slightly, reorganized content, simply because what I want to do is make sure that the main points which we are looking at covering, are addressed within the assessment criteria when we discuss this through the route of these slides. Now, apart from this, what I would also do is during the course of our discussion, I'm also going to look at showing you a quick video, which basically looks at, giving you an idea in terms of how, the human resource planning as a process is generally done. So let's get into this and look at some of the key aspects. Now, one of the bits that we want to understand before we get into anything is understand what is overarching, get a macro idea of overarching idea of what is human resources planning. So when we talk about human resources planning, it is basically a part and parcel of, a process which normally the HR managers do within an organization And there, the process of human resource planning is primarily, looking at um, essentially saying, let's look at identify resources, people's capabilities, and with their capabilities, what we want to be able to do is basically assign them roles and responsibilities that they can complete at the end of the year or at the end of the financial year, and thereby helping the organization to achieve the objectives. Now, this is a process which is strategic in nature. And I say that this is strategic in nature is because the organization identifies, and plans for its human resources needs in particular. That means if I look at giving an example that this year, maybe the NHS is looking at bringing in 20% efficiency in some of the hospitals or reducing the A&E wait times. If I look at a business organization, the business organization might be looking at, saying that we want to increase the turnover from 1 million to 2 million this year. So here, the main point would be that the human resource planning part of the process would identify what are the human resources needs. That means how many people do we need to be able to plan and successfully achieve these objectives. Now, if efficiencies have to be, let's say, achieved, that means savings have to be done. Then in some cases, it also involves forecasting, which would mean that the organization would need to forecast how its revenue would go up or how its demand in terms of services will go up and down or fluctuate during the course of the year. And then accordingly, the HR department will put in strategies of hiring, training, for example, retaining employees by giving incentives or rewards. And thereby they would try and ensure that they have the right people with the right skills to be able to do the right jobs and deliver for the organization. So this particular process is quite important. And it's an annualized process, which generally all organizations will go through when they look at, planning for a new financial year or for a new, academic year, or for example, January to December or June to, July or April to March, whatever financial year they follow. And the main objectives of this planning process is to look at forecasting for what would be the needs which would be coming up in the year in terms of helping to ensure HR's role of how they will fulfill that strategy. So if it looks at efficiency, productivity, increasing roles and responsibilities, then training and development will become important. If it needs to increase headcount, then proper process in terms of recruitment and selection would need to be put in place. And then if it looks at not hiring any new resources for the year, because the headcount is maybe at the optimal level and there is no threshold or no leeway available to be able to increase, budgeting on this side, then the focus would be on retaining and training and development, because here the organization would want to train the existing employees to increase the skill set or to help them, get newer skills. And at the same time, they would put some reward system in place, which would mean that the employees who are taking up additional work or have been given more work over a point in time would be motivated enough to perform those activities. And that is where reward systems will come in. Sometimes this planning as a process is also done when change is being introduced. Now, this is something that you need to look at creatively and think about, that when do we look at bringing change in the organization? From a business perspective, it could be that maybe the company's products, services, consumer base, customer base, competition have brought across some of these changes, could be internal and external, and have been brought across. And then these changes need to be implemented. And because these changes have to be managed within the organization, and the organization still needs to continue grow, then there is where the resource planning side of things come in. If I look at the health service, or if I look at, give an example of National Health Service, one of the changes which sometimes NHS does bring across is during COVID, for example, if we look at the implementation of, although most staff in the NHS, healthcare workers, nurses, health assistants and other clinical staff definitely use PPE, but during the course of COVID, the use of PPE, even when dealing and offering services to patients or looking after patients, the use of personal and protective equipment, PPE, became very important. And this was primarily done because there was a change introduced within the NHS, although it meant that a lot of PPE was being used, but it was vital to restrict the infections, transmission of infections from patients to, practitioners who were providing this care. So when change is introduced within the organization during COVID, there were lots of changes done within the NHS and the structure of the NHS. And these changes were primarily done to ensure that the National Health Service is capable of adapting to these changes because of the pandemic. And such changes were introduced, which were technology driven. There were changes which were primarily regulatory changes like lockdowns and restrictions in terms of visiting hours or no visits to the care homes, and certain wards like CCTU or cardiac wards wherein rate of infection can be higher. And these changes were done primarily because there was an increased risk of transmission of infection. So human resources planning also looks at managing change, if I would put it this way. And this could be in difficult situations or in situations wherein, the external factors are forcing the organization to embrace change. And last but not the least, you would also see human resource planning looks at a very important function, which is primarily after you have your appraisals at the end of the year. I'll put it this way: what is the objective of the appraisal activity? The objective of the appraisal activity is to be looking at how do we give more responsibility or look at progression for the employee within the organization. Most of you as learners who are doing this course are looking at progressing from level 4 to 5. So at some stage in the background, you have this in your mind, is that what would be the progression that you would be looking at some stages, and that is something which always is crossing your mind. So when we look at progression or when we look at planning for future, that will also be dependent on what is called the process of human resources planning. Because essentially, let's face it, human resources or HR side of things in terms of planning is always done by, or done within the organization. And when we look at this side of planning, this sort of planning typically tends to be done because the organization needs to have, enough resources, and, whether it's, resources on physical, financial side of resources, administration would get involved, or maybe the operations department would do it. If you look at financial side of planning, the finance department or the accounts department will look at speaking to banks, maybe the management, the investors, looking at arranging for overdrafts. If they have increased, billing or outflow of money or working capital and requirements are there, then they will speak to bank or bank managers, give a proposal. And this side of financial planning would be done within the finance or the account department. Strategic planning would be done within the marketing department in terms of going out, reaching out to customers. Similarly, human resource planning would be done primarily with, the human resources department, because here what they are looking at primarily is the aspect of ensuring that the organization is geared and has the required and requisite resources to be able to, perform some of these functions. Now, there's a very short video which I would want to play and explain that, why this process tends to be, an important process within the organization. So let me switch you over to this short video that we want to watch, and this would help you understand, the process of human resources planning. So let me do this shift. 1 second. So here we go.
Planning, which is frequently a direct consequence of implementing strategies to move the organization forward. HR planning deals with determining how many people will be needed to execute an organization's specific functions, a key concern in both global and domestic firms. Resource planning is the process of analyzing and identifying the need and availability of people so that the organization can meet its strategic objectives. The human resource planning process includes 4 distinct steps. Let's take a look at each. The focus of HR planning is ensuring that the organization has the right number of people with the right capabilities at the right times and in the right places. It's a 4-step planning process that includes reviewing, assessing, forecasting, and taking action on human resource needs. Notice that the process begins with considering the organizational plans and environmental analysis that went into developing strategies. The process includes an environmental analysis to identify the context in which HR is operating. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are considered. Then the possible available workforce is evaluated by identifying both the internal and external workforce. Once those assessments are complete, the forecast must be developed to determine both the demand and supply of human resources. Management then formulates HR staffing plans and actions needed to address imbalances in both the short and the long term. Particular strategies may be developed to fill vacancies or deal with surplus employees. Finally, HR plans are developed to provide specific direction for the management of HR activities related to recruiting, selecting, and retaining employees. The most telling evidence of successful HR planning is the consistent alignment of the availabilities and capabilities of human resources with the needs of the organization over a considerable period of time. Human capital solutions are also available that enable HR managers to identify how to develop talent to allow the organization to reach its strategic goals.
So as you can see, this small video highlights the emphasis of what is the importance of human resource planning within an organization. Now, if I have to summarize and basically put it this way, that when we look at the whole process of HRP or human resources planning, basically what we need to be able to do is check the capability of the organization to be able to meet its yearly objectives. And as far as that is possible, or whatever steps are required to primarily make that possible is something what the HR department would look at in terms of the human resources planning process. Now, in summary, there are various ways through which this planning process can be highlighted. And this planning process typically tends to be, there are lots of different types of, let's put it this way, planning processes available. The video typically highlighted 4 processes in general, but what we look at is POLC. There is a cycle called POLC, and that particular cycle, when we look at, basically looks at defining or basically gives you the framework through which planning, organizing, leading, and controlling of human resources, can be done. So when we look at this particular aspect of human resources planning, sometimes you apply the POLC framework, and this POLC framework helps you to basically look at planning, organizing, leading, and controlling the resources which are required to be able to achieve organizational objectives in the end of the year. And that is what primarily, was also highlighted in the video. Now, any questions on this so far? Okay, so let's go into some of the assessment criteria. The first assessment criteria, this was an important part that we needed to understand so that we are able to address some of the assessment criteria, because they will revolve around the concept and process of human resources planning. The first assessment criteria talks about the need for why HRP or human resource planning needs to be done in a workplace. Now, it is quite evident that in order for the organization to achieve its objective or goals at the end of the year, whether it's sales goals, target goals, revenue-related goals, quality goals, efficiency goals, productivity goals, what the organization would need to do is do some sort of planning. And this planning would involve, certain key areas. These key areas typically tend to be, manpower needs, which is how many people will be required or what. Because sometimes HR knows that if there are people leaving a particular job or a role, then they have a bit of a notice period. So they know that, okay, this person might be leaving, this person, when he or she leaves, we need to look at, filling up that vacancy. So obviously, manpower planning needs will be done within the organization to ensure that there are enough resources or people available to be able to do their job roles. That would mean new recruitment. That would mean selection, recruitment process. In some cases, when organizations go through a tough patch, so when NHS looks at, for example, bringing in efficiencies in terms of budgets and utilization, there are manpower cuts which typically happen, reduction in terms of number of doctors, nurses, locum, overtime, which is paid to different staff is basically reduced. And that is basically nothing but manpower planning. Now, when we look at other areas, there could be planning in terms of strategic roles or reasons for the organization. And these could be because the organization is looking at making a strategic change in the direction of how it offers its services to consumers in the market. It could be because of competition, reaction to a competitor activity, because there is a Me Too product which has been introduced. And sometimes you would also see that these would be long-term goals which the organization is trying to fulfill. One of the things that the National Health Service tries to do is working on a plan is to basically reduce the amount of waste which comes out of the hospitals and various operations within the National Health Service setup. So what they want to do is reduce and help this particular waste which is coming out, so that this waste can be recycled and obviously then brought back into the system, thereby reducing the harm to the environment. Now, this is a goal which every employee has a role to play in, and is not a goal which can be completed in 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. It's a long-term strategic goal of the organization or the National Health Service. There could be something similar which we look at in businesses, wherein corporate social responsibility or CSR is put in for looking at sustainability, for looking at reducing the amount of material which goes to landfill, look at recycling, look at water conservation. There are different aspects of it, looking at fair wages, to their workers, looking at fair conditions within their factories if they are outsourcing work to suppliers or contractors. These are bits which will be covered from a business perspective within the corporate social responsibility side of things. And they would involve, a strategic intent. That means this is not a goal which is a short-term goal. It's a long-term goal for the organization. And the organization, in terms of human resource planning, would try and ensure that they have the right people to be able to execute those strategies over a period of time. And that is where the strategic part of human resources planning would come into in a particular workplace. The other examples would typically include recruitment and selection, retaining, retention, or if I put it this way, through rewards and incentives, looking at, succession planning, and also looking at one of the key aspects which the human resource planning would ensure is to minimize risk, any sort of risk which can occur because of say, for example, worker shortages, or in terms of any risks which it can face because of not adequate amount of people not being there to be able to, say, perform those functions. And other side of the risk, which I would put it this way, would be risk which is primarily related to, compliance or legislation. So when you look at the National Health Service in particular, there are lots of different acts and legislations which the staff need to be aware of: nurses, practitioners, therapists, doctors, consultants, surgeons, healthcare workers. They need to be aware of. They need to be aware of things like Health and Safety, Data Protection Act, which are other acts which would be involved would be things like Mental Health Capacity Act, the CARE Act, looking at, acts which are related to equality, discrimination, person-centered approach. These are bits which the employees would need to be aware of. So that is where the employer's responsibility, or the National Health Service responsibility, or the primary care trust, which basically manage, fund, and operate the hospitals in various regions in the UK, would have that responsibility to ensure that all the staff working within any particular function, department within the organization is adequately trained in order to ensure that they are minimizing the risk which could be posed by let's say patients, if they feel that they've been neglected, if they feel that the procedure has not been followed, if they feel that there have been negative side effects of what treatment they've received. So in those cases, making sure that everything runs through the process and follows through in terms of compliance would help minimize the risks for the organization in terms of any sort of costs which come in onto the NHS because it has failed to deliver on the service or the quality of service which is promised in its let's say in its agenda. Now, some of you might be aware that last year there was a figure which was published in the news that NHS is sued by its own patients, and NHS loses 448 million pounds every year, almost every year, and this was the highest last year in terms of counter suits which come in from patients wherein they feel that the quality of care or the care promised has not been delivered to the standard, and this has led to negative effects or other types of illnesses within the patients. So this negligence costs which basically come in is also the cost which human resources planning looks at, which is to minimize risk so that compliance is there with legislation, law, and the staff is adequately trained and recruited in such a way that they are aware of these basic aspects of how care is to be given or provided to the patient. And that would be the whole process of human resource planning. Now, because the STAR says assess, so what you would need to do is, and it says in a workplace, so that means you would need to look at maybe an organization essentially to be able to take an example and then do the assessment in the case of assessing the work plan, workforce requirements for that particular organization. So what I've done as an example is taken, 3 different types of businesses, and one, say, call center, one engineering, and one, a small business, or in this case, you could take the example of the NHS, and then basically classified using a table, what are the various manpower requirements or human resource planning requirements for that kind of a business. So if you look at a small business, it's family owned, it produces, for example, it's an agriculture business, it produces its own fruit and veg, and obviously it employs 4 members of the family. There are some seasonal workers which are employed. And then if you look at, they basically produce strawberries and 20 other different types of product. They have a physical resource requirement of land, which is 50 acres, which requires tilling, farming, irrigation, and other bits, which obviously need to be maintained when the plants are going. They need weedicides, insecticides, things like that to be sprayed to ensure they are able to protect the crops. And then for other such physical requirements, they would look at, is there enough parking space within the sheds or in and around the area where the employees would come and, work within the farms. They would have containers and other physical equipments to be able to store the crops when it is harvested. And these would then be, completing the requirement of planning at the business. Similarly, an engineering business, you could do it for the NHS or a particular surgery or a particular hospital. And that would mean that this would help you assess the requirements of human resources planning as a process within a particular workplace. You can take your own organization or your own place of work, anonymize the name of the business, and then classify it in terms of, assessing the requirements. And that would be, showing the practical aspect of that. You understand how do we assess human resource planning requirements in a particular workplace. Is that okay? Right. Some of the bits which I've explained, things like staff turnover, how does forecasting work, also are a part and parcel of the planning process. So 2 slides in particular, which I want to look at. When we talk about, human resource planning, and we look at the process of forecasting, what is forecasting? Forecasting is basically looking at whether the organization would need to hire more staff or reduce its existing staff. And this would depend on how the organization is growing and what are the strategic objectives of the organization. So this is a planning or a process of planning which the organization key personnel in the HR side do when they look at resource planning for human resources or staff, employees in particular, contractors in particular, and they would look at this planning. Now, a simple example of this planning, if I give you from a point of view of actual practice, within an organization, even in UK Versity, when we look at, just as an example, we have 3 different types of planning processes on recruitment. We have people on 0-hour contract, we have people on part-time contracts, we have people on full-time contracts on company payroll. Now, every year we do this planning at our end to see how many students we are going to, teach, what are the courses that we are going to run, and what are the capabilities that we need in terms of staff to be able to train and, obviously run this organization like clockwork. So in this case, we sometimes issue 0-hour contracts, we issue part-time contracts, and we issue full-time contracts. And that is basis the needs and requirements of the organization. Similarly, when you look at forecasting, this is the process that we follow once a year when the planning is done. to see that, okay, if we are going to be teaching, say, 2,000 students this year, we would need an additional headcount of maybe 5 or 6 lecturers. So then the planning process starts, and this planning process would then start into looking at recruitment and selection. Recruitment and selection itself as a process is quite detailed. We look at creating a job description. We look at getting a management approval. We look at basically fixing the job profile, the pay scale. Then at some stage, we'll start advertising. We'll either go to a retained agency, advertise on our own, put it on the job boards. Once the advertisement of the job description, the job vacancy is done, then we start the process of shortlisting. When people are applying, we are shortlisting CVs and looking at the key bits which meet the criteria that we've created internally in terms of the job description. After that, the process of selection would start, which would involve interviewing, which would involve maybe a practical test or an interview, and essentially vetting of their previous experience and references. At some stage, the selection process would move from interview to an offer stage. The offer letter would be given to the shortlisted candidate. Then, given a bit of time, the candidate would join. We would do some reference checks. And once that is done, the offer letter means the person has accepted the offer and they start the work. Then there is a probation period of 4 to 6 weeks. That is to be followed to see whether the person joined is adequately performing, meeting the objectives which have been set. And that at some stage, when they complete the probation period, a permanent contract would be issued, and that would conclude the process of recruitment and selection. So within each of these broad steps that I'm mentioning, there are more detailing or more steps involved in each of these processes. So when I say recruitment and selection, as you can see, it start with job description, advertisement, shortlisting, interview, offer letter, acceptance, issue a probation period, and the final issue of a contract. And this is to highlight the importance of human resources planning. And this forecasting is done by the HR department, HR manager, or somebody who's the HR officer within the organization, depending on the scale and size of the organization. And this would be looking at managing the resource requirement vis-a-vis the capability which the organization needs to have to be able to achieve the objectives at the end of the year. If it's a sales organization, sales turnover is to be increased. Obviously, sales managers would be required, and obviously each of the sales manager would carry a certain target, and they would need to look at budgeting for when do they start recruiting, at what time, so that they are able to help the organization meet this particular objective. Staff turnover is another important term which you would come across. And this staff turnover term is basically, turnover means the number of staff coming and joining the organization and then leaving the organization. So staff turnover, if there is a higher staff turnover, that means the organization has a churn, which means a lot of employees join, but they leave after a short period of working within the organization. And that contributes to what is called the process of recruitment and selection being repeated a number of times. This can cost the organization time, effort, and money, because every time you recruit, then you train the employee, and then the employee ends up leaving in a short period of time because of whatever reasons. That is causing a loss to the organization in terms of time, reputation, and even resources. So staff turnover is quite important. And sometimes you would look at would make voluntary redundancies. That means they will offer a golden handshake to the employees to say, we want to reduce the headcount, we want to reduce the outflow or the profitability and retain the organization's profitability for the long run. They would look at making some staff redundant by offering them what are called final salary packages. In some cases, organizations look at making redundancies because they feel this side of the business has become defunct or is not contributing enough revenue. And if their staff cannot be redeployed elsewhere in the organization, then we look at the process of redundancies or, shortlisting people who would be, leaving the company and helping to save a bit of bottom line by looking at reducing salary and other payouts. And that would be all included within what is called staff turnover. Any questions on this assessment criteria? Okay, let's look at 3.2, which talks about evaluating the methods used to monitor the employee performance. So when I look at the methods used to employ the monitoring of the employees. Here we are looking at talking about various techniques through which the organization, one, can motivate the employees, and second, we are looking at how do they look at primarily, ensuring that the staff remains committed to the organization and its objective. So when we talk about motivational theories, and when we talk about some of these theories that we know in terms of which helps the HR managers drive, let's say, targets and basically keep the employees committed and loyal to the organization. We know of motivation theories like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We are also aware of Hertzberg's two-factor theory, and there are lots of them. And then some of the important ones that I'm listing out, and then the other one that we know is McGregor's, theory X and Y, two-factor theory X and theory Y. So here we look at, and maybe one other which I would like to include is the expectancy theory. And the reason I say is because this is a part and parcel of, the indicative content. Now, these motivational theories that we talk about, are important because they are used as tools by the human resources department to motivate employees to, provide them incentives, rewards, if they are showing the right behaviors, if they're achieving the targets, or if they are meeting the guidelines of their job description. Then these are used in practical aspects to be able to retain employees, to keep them motivated, to make them loyal to the organization, to ensure that they stay within the organization as a retention strategy. So all these are used as, motivators to be able to influence people by looking at, looking at individual or different factors, which would mean meeting their individual needs, their requirements, and also to ensure that the environment in which they work within the office is conducive and is all inclusive, which means they feel that they are wanted within the company. They feel, that they are cared for within the organization, and their personal characteristics and values and expectations are rewarded if they show the right, say, for example, let's say that they show the right dependencies in terms of how they are working within the organization and helping the organization to achieve a certain objective. So they would be required primarily to ensure that the HR knows the employees quite well. Sometimes now, because of technology, organizations also use what is called the employee productivity software or performance tracking software, and these can be used to monitor work performance of an employee. One such software that we know and we have used, or some of you would have got access to and used, is the Salesforce software, or CRM, Customer Relationship Management Software. Now, this software is an integrated package which basically, ensures that what activities they perform, like calling, sales, emails, or getting in touch with the customer, are all activities which are recorded within the software. And these activities, when they are recorded in the software, can help contribute and create an overall dashboard to show how the employee has worked, or what are the efforts the employees have put into secure business, or go in front of the customer, depending on the size, on the scale, or the type of business in which your organizational setup or the business you're working in. Now, the HR would use these motivational theories in conjunction with performance-based techniques to help, essentially, I would say, streamline how they would essentially want the employees to work within the organization. And in such cases, you would generally see that when we talk about motivation and we look at, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, essentially, what you will generally see in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there the theory basically proposes, if you have seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if I just bring a quick picture in, you would generally see that, this particular theory proposes, which was introduced by, Maslow in the late 40s and early 50s. He basically proposed that individuals are primarily motivated by certain types of needs. And what he did was he discovered these proposed and discovered these 5 types of needs, and he put them into a pyramid. And in a hierarchical pyramid, wherein he called them as hierarchy of needs. So what it means is, if you look at the base of the pyramid, wherein you have physiological needs, these physiological needs are needs of which are basic needs for the employee. Things like, food, water, shelter, other bits that they have to look at providing. And these needs are basic to any employee which is working within the organization. When they work, they expect that at the end of the month, they get paid, they get a salary, and this salary would then help them meet the basic needs of food, shelter, and other requirements that they are able to provide for the family. Then we talk about safety needs. That means they want personal security, they want stability, they want security in terms of their job role, and they want to ensure that the place they work in, environment they're working is healthy enough and does not cause any detrimental effects or have any negative effects on their health and health of the individual. Then you go up to love and belonging needs, wherein you're talking about friendship, intimacy, family, sense of connection. And this is where employees become loyal to the organization. They decide whether they'll stay in the organization. They will decide whether they are getting enough opportunities through job rotation to be able to work within the company. And then they will look at esteem needs, wherein you get freedom, you want more responsibility, you want delegation to be available, to be able to make independent decisions. And this also is followed by recognition, which means at this stage, the employee within the organization has put in a number of years and they want their work to be recognized. They want recognition in terms of praise, apart from the other benefits of increased salary, responsibility. They are focused on basically their status, which is the title within the organization, and the remuneration they get, and obviously the recognition that they get by accomplishing difficult tasks for the organization. And at the top of the pyramid, you have is self-actualization. That means here the individual wants freedom to be able to put into practice, their best learnings or their experience into the organization to help increase the efforts that they can put in to help the organization reach certain objectives. So you would see the chief executives or the C-level employees working here. When they have a vision, they want to see or steer the organization into a particular direction. Now, this part of the planning, which is done in terms of monitoring and performance related things, is important, because if as an HR manager, I'm aware that where you are within the organization, at what stage of progression you are within the organization. If you're a new recruit and you have just joined, I know the basic needs in your case as an HR manager would be to look at getting confirmed first, and then looking at maintaining a stable working within the organization so that you are completing your probation period, you're getting confirmed, and then at some stage you're becoming an integral part of the organization. Then we look at employees which have worked for 5, 6 years, 7 years. They are mostly concerned that, okay, after a number of years, I've got a promotion, my job responsibilities are increasing, I'm getting an increased pay, and they then tend to evaluate whether they are going to be staying in the organization or not. So here I want to clearly know as an HR manager that apart from the safety needs, which is basic job security, good working environment, I would also be looking at other needs which the employee would be looking forward to, which is things like, more responsibility, and obviously looking at higher connections or inroads into the organization in terms of succession planning. So they are looking at moving to the next role in the next couple of years, and that would be important for me, because if I know that this person is willing to stay within the organization and take increased responsibility, then I need to put a plan in place to ensure that we are able to retain the employee, give him motivation for the next 2 or 3 years before he comes up or she comes up for promotions, and that would allow the employee to stay, and then skills to be retained within the organization. So that is the implementation of the motivational theory in a way which will help progress, monitor, and evaluate the employee performance at the end of the year by the human resources department. And there are various techniques which can be employed, and these techniques which can be employed to basically look at monitoring the employee performance could be done through techniques which are primarily, if I just list it out here, these are, monitoring and performance techniques that we could look at, for employees. So, for example, we could have KPIs, key performance index. We could have appraisals. There could be, comparisons to previous years' achievements and targets which have been done. There could be customer feedback, which is primarily 360-degree appraisal feedback that we normally take is that when you work within an organization, we just don't take feedback from your manager, but we take feedback from your peers, other colleagues, employees, even external people, externally, if you interact with employers, contractors, or suppliers and contractors, and then finally customers. And that would give us a round 360-degree feedback in terms of your overall performance. And then we look at training also as a barometer, because if we feel that there is a shortage of skills, if you do feel that your skills need to be developed, then the organization has to put resources in place to be able to train you. Sometimes these trainings are internal and sometimes these trainings are external. And they form an important part, because you see sometimes employees go across onto seminars, conferences, and this is to motivate them to say that, you need to get an external perspective. The organization is looking at growing and, giving you additional responsibility. Sometimes these are involving overseas trips when you go and attend international conferences. Sometimes they tend to be internal trainings that you keep doing within the organization through the employee portal or training and development, which is organized by the HR department, and in which you get shortlisted as against some of the other employees to get into this particular training. And these are all techniques through which improving and monitoring of your performance can be done from within the organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Now, when we look at the next assessment criteria, it talks about assessing the effectiveness of reward systems in different contexts. Now, here, what we want to be able to do is basically talk about what are the various reward systems that companies can actually employ in terms of providing, to the employee. Now, one slide which I have here is to basically show you a snapshot of what kind of reward systems do the organizations have. Reward systems can be performance-related pay. That means every year, if you achieve your targets, you get a bit of incremental increase in your pay. You could have bonus, which is normally over and above your pay, that is a part and parcel of your overall employee package. These bonuses could be yearly, they could be quarterly, depending on the targets that you're achieving, the KPIs or key performance indicators that you are meeting, and that would mean you are in line to receive the additional payout or bonuses. It could be advancement or promotion, which is basically progression oblique promotion. That means you've been performing a role quite well over the years, and here in this role you have met all the requirements, and the company feels that, and the candidate also feels that it is the right time for me or her to progress onto a higher role with more responsibility. That would mean you're looking at promotion. And these are typically, documented within the organization, that you can move from within one grade to the other grade, say D1 to D2 grade or G to G1 to G2, depending on different companies. This is normally done once in 2 years or once in 3 years. And if you're meeting all the criteria and your review is perfect in the sense that it showcases that you're meeting requirements related to appraisal, meeting the targets of the organization, ensuring that you are adding value to the business. At some stage, what will happen is nurses would go into becoming senior nurses, healthcare workers assistants would become healthcare workers, and these are showing what is called promotion. Then you have share options, and you have status. So, for example, status would mean we are looking at relating this to the self-esteem needs of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which you are looking not just for money, promotion, you're looking for title. That means you become a general manager, you become a director, you become a vice president, you become a senior manager, and this is more about reputation in terms of where you work within the organization and what role and responsibility you have, and what is the stature or the level at which you currently work and how you can move forward. So here the focus would be status. And then last is employee stock options. In a lot of organizations in the private sector, you generally see this in startups or in companies which are newly starting up, especially in the millennium software in the services sector, a lot of chief executives are looking at providing what is called employee stock option plan to its employees. The reason of doing this is to retain the skills and the talent within the organization. And this has a divestment plan that you get certain amount of shares of the company, you become part owners, which keeps you with the company and helps retain the talent within the organization. And there is a divestment schedule. That means there is a schedule which is normally given because these things are locked with your performance. So if you look at organizations, sometimes not in the public sector, but in the private sector, so NHS wouldn't probably have that. But in the private sector, you would generally see it is linked to their performance, their output, how the share market is performed, or the company's share price has performed in the share market. What is the profitability of the net profitability of the organization? If it's increasing under the leadership of a particular person, then obviously what the organization would do is at some stage reward disproportionately the employee by offering them shares of the company. And they are locked, they have a bit of a lock-in period, but after that, the employee can sell those shares in the stock market and obviously realize benefits in terms of monetary benefits, which is increased salary or perks. And that would be an option that you would generally see being given out under called rewards. Now, why are rewards required? Very briefly, rewards are required because they're required because the organization is trying to motivate you to perform better. So in a sales manager situation, if I look at in sales, marketing, business development, the more you get in terms of revenue targets, the more incentives you get at the end of the month in terms of your salary. So if you achieve 100% of your target, you get an X amount, say 1% additional salary. If you achieve 125%, it's 3%. If you achieve 150 and over, it's 5% as an additional salary. And that increases the maximization of your payout and an incentive which is set by the organization for people who are performing or overperforming as per their target. It could be an award for retention, which means like sometimes you see with an organization, I've spent 5 years, the organization will give you a reward at the end of 5 years, maybe a watch which says 5 years and a certification. After 10 years, they will review another reward because you've remained loyal to the organization and obviously stayed and helped contribute to achieving its objective. So different types of awards which are given primarily to retain, motivate, and propel employees to be able to perform better in respect of the organization and to show commitment to their work. So these are the functions of primarily reward systems, which generally organizations put in place. And these are done primarily to ensure that anything related to, I would say anything related to, for example, I would say that importance which is levied onto the importance in terms of achieving the objectives and the employees, staff helping the organization to achieve the objectives would be part and parcel of the reward systems. Any questions on this so far? Any questions? Okay. One of the other things that I would want to put it this way would be like, for example, the next assessment criteria talks about the effectiveness of, rewards. So when I talk about the effectiveness of rewards, what we are looking at is how do organizations ensure that when they put the awards or reward strategy in, the reward strategy is primarily going to be focused on, motivating and retaining the employees in the aspect of, keeping them aligned to the objectives of the organization. So when we talk about different types of rewards, here you would generally see sometimes companies give individual awards. And these individual awards tend to be the more you perform, the more you get, or the more, the more you work, the more you earn. And in some cases, this performance in terms of getting rewards is primarily entirely dependent on yourself. So these could be generally seen in situations wherein targets or objectives given are individually driven. Sometimes you would see team rewards, which is where the companies are trying to look at improving overall efficiency of a department or interdependencies within different departments. They would look at putting team rewards in. So, for example, a product launch is to be done, or some sort of a waste, say, I would say some sort of a exercise is being done within the organization to look at reducing the number of, let's say, some sort of wastage which is happening, and they want to reduce some sort of wastage. So what will happen is, in those cases, the rewards which will be done or provided would be team rewards. So, for example, less dependence on or saving of electricity and resources within the environment. So every employee would be, looking at playing their part to ensure that as a team, they use less electricity. If they are in a particular department, they have less usage of any sort of material like paper or other bits which are going in. Any sort of efficiency which is being brought in because the team works together, that department works together, would be team rewards. And in those cases, you would generally see the organization would encourage what are called team rewards. Then you have monetary and non-monetary rewards. So monetary and non-monetary rewards, monetary tend to be bonuses, promotions. Monetary reward tend to be bonuses, increase in salary, stock options. Non-monetary reward tend to be recognition or time off and, further training and development within the organization. Then we talk about short-term and long-term rewards. So short-term rewards tend to be quarterly bonuses, for example. Long-term reward tend to be pension plans, stock option plans, which are to keep the employees in the organization from a long-term perspective, 5 to 10 years. Then you look at extrinsic and intrinsic rewards. Extrinsic tend to be pay and promotions, and intrinsic tend to be, accomplishment of personal growth rewards. For example, you've achieved a milestone of working within an organization, but you currently also work with charitable objectives. And sometimes you would see employees within organizations contributing to running a 10K marathon or a 4K marathon, and they then setting up a charity page to say, could you help me raise some money for this charity? And that is primarily intrinsic reward. That means for personal growth, for a personal sense of accomplishment, and you would follow these from a point of view of, reward systems as well. And they would essentially be part and parcel of how rewards can be seen in different contexts, whether it's performance related, whether it's bonuses, whether it's advancement or promotion, whether it's for status, whether it's for long-term benefits of the organization to retain the talent and increase the skills by looking at training and development. And stock options would be the aspects of the effectiveness of reward systems and how to use them. That is what effectively the HR would be looking at doing. So this helps us cover, the 4 assessment criteria that are required to understand how to maximize effectiveness of human resources. Any questions on today's discussion?
No, please.
Okay, so
No, sir.
Go ahead. Sorry, you were saying something. Okay.
No.
Okay, that's fine. No worries. So this particular presentation is up on Moodle. And what I would do is basically tomorrow's session, we'll be looking at covering learning outcome 4. And that would help us complete this particular unit. And next week would be discussion on the assignment session. So go through some of the bits which are given here in terms of, some of the additional reading that you could do, which is given here in terms of, benefits of software, which currently organizations are using to effectively, manage human resources and to help increase productivity and efficiency. These are good articles that you could read. And I would suggest that this is something that you should do after going through this particular session as a bit of homework. So I will see you guys tomorrow for learning outcome 4. Thank you so much for joining, and take care and bye for now.
Thank you.